Hi everybody, it's Denise from Nuddles. I am here today to teach you how I bind my quilts. I have a pretty comfortable way that I do it and I want to share it with you guys because I really feel like the binding of the quilt is the finishing touch, the final step, and I really think that it's easy to make it done right, and I just want to show you the way that I do that and make my bindings come out perfect. So first I'll show you how I create my binding. I prefer, and this is kind of a personal preference, but I'll explain to you why I do it the way I do it. So I use, 2¼ inch wide strips of fabric to make my binding. So I've cut my fabric 2¼ inches wide. You can cut it on the bias, you can cut it on the straight of the grain. The nice thing about the bias is when it wraps around your quilt, it just wraps a little bit smoother. You get a nice smooth fold when it wraps around your quilt, so I like that. But sometimes you don't have the right size piece of fabric in order to make that work. So if you're doing it on the bias, it's a 45-degree angle. Cut that fabric on the 45. Again, I cut them 2¼ inches wide. Fold the fabric in half, so it's about 1 1/8 raw edges together, and then it's ready to go. Just be careful because if you have cut it on the bias, it gets really stretchy, and just be aware of that. Just be a little bit careful about the stretch. Okay, so I've joined most of my binding. I've created my long piece. The fact of the matter is, if you need whatever the circumference of your quilt is, so the total of all 4 sides of your quilt, you need enough binding to get around that, plus a few inches extra for the corners and stuff. But I'm just going to show you quickly how I join my strips so that you can make your binding long enough to get around your quilt. I have pre-folded this. Usually I press it after I've done this process, but I wanted to just show you right here. So you're going to put your fabrics right sides together on the corner. I usually leave a little bit of overhang on the edges. The reason I do that is because it helps me see where that intersection happens. So I'm going to stitch from point to point where that intersection happens. If you don't, you'll notice that you'll get a little bit of a raised edge in your fabric when you unfold it. So I'm going to stitch from point to point across here. If you want to, you can stay right there and draw the line. I'll draw the line so that you can see that I'll stitch corner to corner. Okay, and that's where I'll stitch. You can pin that if you feel comfortable with that, but this is where I'll stitch. I've got my walking foot on right now, and I'll talk about that in a second. This seam you could be doing with your regular sewing foot, but because you're just stitching on that line. So if you notice, if you get that seam to end right in the corner, my thread looks pink because my chalk was pink. I thought for a second there, what the heck? You get a nice straight line that goes across when your stitching happens right in the corner. If you miss that corner and you kind of just float off to the side, you're going to get a bump in your stitching there. You won't get a straight line. Then what I do is I trim the excess to about 1/4 inch. You can do this with scissors or rotary cutter, whichever, honestly, for me, whichever is handy. One other thing that I do here is I press this seam open. So I know sometimes people join your bias strips together, or your binding strips together just straight across. The problem that you run into when you have the seam going straight across here is you create a really lot of bulk in the quilt when you've got a seam straight across here. So that's why it's nice to do it on the diagonal. And then when we press the seam open, fold it in half, you've really got really minimal bulk in your binding, okay? So that's how you're gonna create your binding strip. It's ready for me to put onto my quilt, so I'm gonna grab my quilt and show you how we do this. I'm going to use the walking foot to stitch the binding onto the quilt. I've seen a lot of people not use the walking foot for this process, and I feel pretty strongly that it's really important for the final step of your quilt, for the stitching to be even and the feed to be nice and smooth so you get a nice flat finished quilt. So here's the walking foot. Yes, I'm sewing on a Bernina, but quite honestly, it can be any sewing machine, and the construction of the walking foot is really pretty similar. So there's a fork right here that moves up and down. It's really important that the needle screw, the part where the needle attaches, is fitting right inside that fork there. So I'm going to show you that fork goes right around your needle screw, and then you're going to fasten your walking foot onto your machine however your feet fasten on. Some of them screw on the Bernina, it just clips on pretty quickly and easily. So that's how you're going to apply your walking foot to your machine, no matter what machine it is. So we're dealing with not only the 2 layers of fabric on our quilt plus batting plus 2 to 4 layers of binding. I say 4 because we may wrap it around later and add some layers there. So with all of that fabric feeding through your machine, if you don't use the extra feed that the walking foot provides, your fabric will shift, just like if you're sewing a straight line on a quilt. So I feel really strongly that the walking foot's going to add the extra feed that we need for the binding not to shift and for the layers of your quilt not to shift as you stitch it on. There's a choice we have to make now before we start to stitch our binding on, and that choice is, how are we going to finish our binding? Are we going to finish the binding on the back side of the quilt by hand, or are we going to finish the binding on the front side of the quilt on the machine? It's really, for me, it depends on the quilt. It depends on if it's something I want to hang and I want to be really special, I'll do it by hand. If it's something I want to get done fast and be durable, maybe for a baby or for something not necessarily as special, although every quilt is special, I may do it on the machine. And there's some really fun, cute ways that you can stitch the binding on with the machine for that second step. So the reason we need to decide that before we start stitching is because if you're going to stitch your binding, the second step of your binding on by hand, I'm going to suggest that you sew it to the front of the quilt first. That way when it wraps around to the back, you can hand stitch on the back. Whereas if you're going to machine stitch second, I would suggest that you sew the binding to the back of the quilt first, wrap it around to the front, and then you can do your machine stitching from the front of the quilt. There's other ways to do it too, but we're going to start with the basic, solid, good quality binding, awesome binding. Okay, so I like to start stitching the binding on. I'm going to sew this onto the back of the quilt, and then later I'm just going to machine stitch it to the front. This is a sample for a ruler work class that I have coming up, Amanda Murphy's Meadow Dance ruler panel. And so I'm going to bind this, and I will machine stitch it on to the front after I'm done attaching the binding. So I'm going to leave about 8 inches of fabric hanging unstitched at the beginning of my binding process. And I will start on a side, in the middle of the side of the quilt. Okay, so I'm just gonna lay the binding on here. I don't pin this. You'll see when I get to a corner that it doesn't really help me to have it pinned. So I'm gonna start here. I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the process, the math involved in how wide I cut my binding strip kind of has a lot to do with the seam allowance that I want in my finished binding. So I'm going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. On this walking foot and on a lot of the walking feet out there, there's usually a marking, a guide of some sort that tells you where that 1/4 inch is. On the Bernina, there's a little cutout in the foot that shows you where that 1/4 inch seam allowance actually lives. So I'm going to lay the raw edge of my quilt right on that 1/4 inch marking, and I'm just going to start to stitch my binding on. I don't need to pull from the back. When you're piecing your quilt, you don't pull the fabric from the back. You just let the machine feed the fabric through. With the walking foot on, I don't need to pull through. I can just easily guide my binding and easily guide my quilt through the machine with my nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. Be careful not to stretch this binding strip as you go. It really wants to stretch, especially since I cut it on the bias. Be careful not to let it stretch. Just let it lay, and it will feed through nice and smooth. When you get to the point where you have one of your joining seams, try to make sure you left your seam allowance the way you pressed it, so with that seam open. When we get to the corner, this is kind of a really important part for me, and I'll show you how I stitch my corner. So again, on the walking foot, at least on this Bernina walking foot, there is also a marking 1/4 of an inch in front of the needle. So 1/4 of an inch before the needle. So I know to stop stitching 1/4 of an inch from the edge of my fabric. So if you look under here, you can see where my quilt ends. I want to stop stitching 1/4 of an inch before that point. And there's a little hash mark, again, right in front of the needle, 1/4 of an inch to show me where that is. So I'm just going to kind of slowly stitch to the corner. I've set my machine so that the needle will end in the down position. And then what I'm going to do, this is a nice, pretty important step for me. I'm actually going to pivot, leave my needle down in the fabric. I'm going to turn my fabric to a 45-degree angle and stitch right off the corner of the quilt. Okay, so I took that 45-degree angle and I stitched right off the corner of the quilt. I'll pull it out of the machine so you can see a little bit better. And I carefully chose white thread so that you could see the contrast. So I stitched 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way. When I got to 1/4 of an inch from here, this distance is 1/4 of an inch, I pivoted, turned to the corner and stitched right off the edge. Okay, I'm now going to turn my quilt so that I can prepare to stitch the next side. The way I fold this, I'm sitting on my binding. Hold on. I've taken the fabric out of the machine. I clipped my thread. I turned my quilt 90 degrees to the right or counterclockwise so that I can prepare to stitch my next side. What I need to do, this folding process is pretty important to get us a nice clean corner. I folded my binding strip back out of the way, and I've created this 45-degree angle here. And I've also, the easier way to see is I've created a straight line here with my quilt to my binding strip. So you don't want it to be kind of off to the side one way or the other. You want to make a nice straight line here. And then you've got that nice 45-degree angle here. Then what you're going to do is pull the binding strip back down, line up the binding strip on the edge of your quilt, but it's also really important that you get a nice clean fold even up at the top. You don't want to have a little bit of extra overhang here, and you don't want it to hang short or crooked. You want it to be nice and straight and even with the edge of your quilt. And the third thing that you're looking for is that fold that you created on the side is nice and even as well. You don't want to have, again, a little bit of extra from the underneath fold there. You want it to be nice and even. Okay, now I'm going to start to stitch this onto the machine. When I stopped earlier, I stopped 1/4 of an inch from the edge and pivoted off the corner. What I'm going to do differently this time is I'm going to start right at the fold, right at the edge of the quilt, and work my 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. Okay, so start right at the edge of the fabric. Following that 1/4 inch seam allowance on the edge of the foot, right on the inside edge of the foot here, and I'm just going to work my way down the next side of my quilt. Okay, so I've stitched the rest of my binding on, and I've got myself about 12 or so inches here unstitched that I'm going to work with to join my binding. This is the part that I think people struggle with the most. So I really want to spend some time here showing you how to make this totally perfectly successful every time. So here's the tail that I left earlier unstitched, about 6 or so inches. I've cut this straight. Yours may have been on an angle when you started. I've cut it off so it's straight. Then what I'm going to do is take the remaining edge of my binding strip that I have and overlap these two. So you have to ask yourself here, how wide did you cut your binding strip when you started, the width of these strips? I cut mine 2 1/4 so that when I stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and wrap it around, it will cover my stitching and not leave any gap in my edge with no batting and not be too uneven on the front to the back. So the goal is to get the front of the binding and the back of the binding to be about the same width when you're done and not have a space where the batting doesn't fill the edge of that fold. So that's how I come up with 2 1/4 inches. If you want a wider seam allowance, then you may make your binding strip a little bit wider or narrower, whatever, depending. So I cut my binding strip width to 2 1/4. Therefore, when I do this step and I overlap these 2 strips, I want the overlap to be 2 1/4. So whatever the width of your strip is, that's what you want this overlap to be here. So I've got my 2 strips folded nice and flat. Again, be careful not to stretch that top strip. It's gonna wanna stretch pretty easily, but don't let it do that. And then I've set my my ruler to 2 1/4 inches, and I will cut off the excess here so I have a 2 1/4 inch overlap. Now I need to join these 2 pieces. It's really simple, and if we overthink it, we usually do it wrong, but that's okay. So I will take my 2 strips. They need to go right sides together. So all I'm going to do is open them up and put them right sides together. Don't twist them, don't turn one upside down and wrap it around, just put them right sides together. We always seem to wanna sew it a different way and then we end up with it twisted, and we'll double check that before we go and trim it. I've marked a line across where we're going to sew. Honestly, usually when I do this on my own, I don't mark this line. I find it a little bit easier just to eyeball it and stitch across. But the way we are going to stitch this one, we put them right sides together. We need to, again, stitch across the diagonal so that we get that nice flat joined seam. And it looks just like all the others. The difference between the way we're going to do it this time and the way we did it last time, before we overlapped the 2 edges and we stitched corner to corner. This time we don't have any excess fabric left to overlap, so we need to come right to the edge here, right to the edge here, stitch exactly from the point here to the point where that intersects down there, so right here, point to point, and that's gonna make the math all work out so that it lines up nice and perfect and it fits right on the edge of our quilt. So I'm going to stitch this now. If you feel like you need to put some pins in there to hold that, go for it. I think we know that I'm not the world's biggest pinner, but but I stitched that seam corner to corner. Before you do anything else, open up your quilt and make sure that you didn't twist it. Make sure that it lays flat. It should fit in there absolutely perfectly. And that is, I'm really happy with that. That's perfect. So now that I made sure I didn't twist it or anything, if I had, I would take those stitches out. Not that I've ever done that before, but if I did, I would take those stitches out and re-sew. But what I'll do now is trim this down to about that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press this guy open. We can just finger press this here. It's a small seam. We can just finger press that in, and it's already been pressed from before, so I should be able to just lay that down and finish that final 12 inch or so seam that I have left to do, and your binding will be done. So let me do that real quick and then I'll show you what it should look like. I don't have to work really hard to get my machine to feed all these layers through. That walking foot really just feeds all the layers through for me. And there shouldn't be any distortion to your quilt. And I think now you see why it would have been hard for me to pin my binding onto the quilt beforehand, because of all the folding back and forth that I had to do to get the corners and everything to line up. So let's see how we did. It lays perfectly here. So I'm ready to stitch the second half of my binding, whether it be the back side of the quilt that I'm hand stitching, or if I'm gonna go to the front of the quilt and machine stitch it, and that's how I'm gonna choose to do this one. But I still need to show you how I finish those corners, because that's a really important part of the process. I am getting ready to machine stitch my binding onto the front of the quilt. I chose to go that route instead of hand stitching to the back. This is just a class sample, although it's really cute and it's gonna be an awesome class. I wanna be able to get it done rather quickly and be able to move on to the next thing. So I've stitched it to the back. I've pressed a little bit from the back side. I've just pressed a little bit. That helps it open up. And then I will wrap it around to the front, and it will cover over the stitching so that white stitching there, a little bit tricky to see. Let me scoot it up because this one's a little bit. So the white stitching here where I joined the binding to the quilt, I just need to make sure that gets covered. And I want the binding on the front and the binding on the back to be relatively even in size. And I also don't want to have, like I said earlier, a big gap in here. I want to be able to feel that batting right on the edge. That's the goal that we're going for. So you may have to play around with the width of your strip, your seam allowance. You may have to play around with those things until you find just that sweet spot, but that's the goal that we're going for. So now I'm going to stitch from the front. I'm just going to use a straight stitch, and I will get it to line up right inside the edge of my binding. I'm actually going to switch the sole on my walking foot so that you can see this really clearly. So let me switch the sole on my walking foot, and then I'll show you how I stitch this. So I have switched the sole on my walking foot, and now I have one with a guide. Not every machine in the industry has this option available, but on the Bernina, since I have this as a guide available, I'm definitely going to use it. So there's a guide that comes down right in the middle of the foot, right where the needle is. I want that guide to rest right on the edge of my fold. Can you see how the guide of the walking foot sits right at the fold of my binding? Then what I'll do is move my needle position over to the right a little bit so that it will catch the binding strip. So now I am stitching the binding onto the front of my quilt. Make sure that your needle is catching that binding strip as you sew. I'll show you that in a second. You can play around with different decorative stitches here too. You can. So I like to do a serpentine stitch, so it's like a zigzaggy stitch that covers over the binding and goes onto the quilt a little bit. That's a really fun, quick way to do a binding. You can use a variegated thread and have it be really cute and decorative. Now we're at the corner. This is the final mystery that we have for binding. So I'm going to show you how I do my corners, and that just makes for a really awesome, crisp, clean binding. So let's look at what we have on the side we've already stitched. If you'll notice, the fold of my binding, it's kind of on, the bulk is on the left-hand side, right? On the right-hand side, it's inside, and the bulk is on the left. What I want to do on the front is the opposite. I want the bulk to be on the right-hand side. It will just lay a little bit flatter, and it will make it for a nice crisp corner. So what that means is the bottom actually needs to fold first, and I really like to get in there and finger press that nice crisp corner. So what you have is a straight line that comes straight across here, and then that 45-degree angle from the corner. So not this, because that's like a curve, and not something hanging down lower. I really want my binding strip to be this right here, to be nice and straight across, and that 45 nice and crisp over here. Then this gets folded. You almost have to get a stiletto, or if you got a fingernail to get in there, you almost need to get that nice and poked inside there so that you can wrap over and get your 45-degree angle that you finger pressed over here, and the nice crisp corner there, and you should get these two spots in the corner to join right together. So let me stitch to the corner. It's a good thing I have 17 hands that I can hold this all with. You can put a pin in there if you need to hold all that. You just please don't sew over your pin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch right up to that point where the two pieces of binding intersect. So I'm going to stitch right beyond where the fold is. One more stitch. I'm not cutting my thread here. I have to just raise my presser foot, leave the needle down in the fabric, and rotate my quilt so I can stitch the next side. I want to have one continuous seam here. So hopefully I caught this piece of fabric up in the corner there, and it's not dangling off on the side. Hopefully you've caught that in there, and then you can just continue on with your next side. I'll continue sewing here, and then I'll show you the next corner again. Okay, so I'm at the corner again, and I just want to review with you that you want to have that overlap be on the opposite side as you did on the back. So if you can see, I've got the extra overlap on the left-hand side on the back. On the front, I want the overlap to be on the right-hand side. So I will fold the bottom down first. Get that nice crisp 45-degree angle here so you get a nice crisp corner, and that will fold over to the front and overlap right on the corner. This is what we're going for. And then I will stitch to this corner. It's nice to get something pointy in there. Got my fancy new stiletto. And get that stitching to happen right at the corner there. And then pivot and continue on. I'm going to stitch this here, and then I'll show you what it looks like from the back side. And I'll finish that off later. So, perfectly perfect corner. That's a nice 45-degree angle there. It's nice and sharp on the back side. I do have spots where the thread shows on the back side. I could have maybe been a little bit more careful to choose a gray thread there that blends in more. If this absolutely drives you crazy, you need to be stitching your bindings on by hand, because you will get this when you machine stitch a binding. For what I'm doing here, I'm totally fine with that. That serpentine stitch as well would balance across the back side of the quilt. But if seeing that thread there on the back makes you crazy, then this isn't the way for you to do your binding. You need to do that hand stitching from the back side. So continue working all the way around your quilt, and by the time you get to the other side, it will just lay flat, zip across, and you are done. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please, if you have questions, let me know. If there's other things that you would like to see me show in a video, I would love to, so please let me know, and hope to see you soon. Thank you. Have a good day.